Gun control, background checks, what do? We got a smart guy on that tonight.
The Dan Yorke State of Mind program is brought to you in part by Lookout Rhode Island and Takeo Comfort Solutions.
He's a former U.S. attorney, and he's running for State Attorney General Peter Neronha. He's my guest this evening, and it's good that he's running for office because, you know, he's got to respond to inquiries. And I get to pick his brain on law enforcement issues, which I think all of us ought to be doing. If somebody wants to run for public office, they ought to have their expertise and their brains picked. And tonight, we'll do a little bit of that tonight, and just kind of throw some theory around on what may be a concrete and constructive result of this last Florida shooting and all of that. So we'll get into that this evening. Nice to have you aboard. Thank you very much for tuning in. Just an update on the Senator Kettle situation, which is just crazy. Of course, he's pled not guilty to 2 counts of extortion in a case involving a former legislative page. He's also jammed up on an allegation that he took photos of his girlfriend. She was unwitting and she was not clothed. And he sends them up to a friend, allegedly, and the friend exchanges photos of his wife, allegedly. What time is it, 7:30? Kids might be in the kitchen. You know, so it's just one of those things that is a little bit crazy. Of course, the defense is kind of strange, too.
It has to be for the purpose of sexual gratification. The second issue is what it has to be. So I don't think he did that.
We wouldn't have charged if there wasn't gratification.
Right? Well, anyway. Now comes the ongoing conversation about his status. And interestingly enough, the Senate President and the minority leader of the Senate, Kettle is a Republican, by the way, one of 5 that fit in a phone booth. Now it's a smaller phone booth, most likely. They've been suggesting that, if he doesn't resign, they're going to kick him out by a 2/3 vote. There is a constitutional provision which has never been exercised in our legislature to send somebody packing. And they've been pretty informal and verbose about it. And the ACLU sent a letter yesterday. There's a headline here that reflects that. They say, hey, slow this thing down. I mean, despite whatever you might think about what he's charged with, you need a process. You just can't be, boasting about how you're going to send somebody out stage left. And in response, the Senate has indicated that they are, as this headline or press release probably indicates, they are going to set up a process by which they will have a House Judiciary Committee hear legislation that calls for his expulsion, and Senator Kettle will get to come testify. I thought we had a headline or some reflection on that. There it is. There's the press release. Hard to read unless you got a 72-inch screen. But the point is that they are setting up some formal process. Now, will that all be stymied by Mr. Kettle saying, I'm all done? I don't know. It's Rhode Island, man. A little wacky. All right. Headlines out of Florida continue to come, and here's the latest where the kids take the 7-hour bus ride up to the state capitol.
Close to 100 students arrived early Wednesday morning at Florida's capital in Tallahassee to make their voices heard. They were greeted with applause late last night when they got off buses after a 7-hour trip from Parkland, tired but ready to make a change.
This is never going to happen again like this. No more families won't have their kids at home anymore. No more families will have to fear about their kids going to school.
The students are meeting with legislators from both sides of the aisle to push for tougher gun laws, including stricter background checks and raising the age to purchase an assault rifle. But on Tuesday, Florida lawmakers struck down a motion to consider a bill proposing a ban on assault rifles. Some state legislators argue gun ownership is a constitutional right and the focus should be on school security and better mental health screenings. Stoneman Douglas students were emotional after the vote.
The next death of someone with an assault rifle here in Florida is going to be on them.
And while these students are at the Capitol, funerals continue at home today for their classmate Nicholas Dwert and the school's athletic director, Chris Hickson.
I mean, unbelievable, huh? It just is
Terrible. Terrible. You've seen it far too many times. As I was coming over to see you today, heard the kids in Florida talking. Incredibly powerful voices of courage. I think what makes this maybe a little different is that these kids can speak for themselves. I mean, Newtown, as horrible as it was, those
little ones.
Little ones, right? These are high school students who lost. I heard one young person say, I lost the person who sat next to me in class. I'm going back to school next week. That person's not going to be there. Grief counselors can only do so much. No, it's terrible. It's terrible. It's tragic. And great courage by these kids to talk about this. In a way, we all should be having this conversation.
Well, it's interesting that these young people, under this theme of never again, are becoming so verbal about it. The adults in this country, elected or not, are stuck.
Oh, we're stuck, yeah.
Stuck. The kids don't feel stuck. They're not very mature in terms of the ways of government and legislative action and response, but they're not stuck.
No, I mean, I think they can see areas of common ground that we ought to be able to get something done on. I mean, if you look at background checks, most people agree on the background checks, but what prevents us from getting background checks done, in my opinion, is universal background checks for every gun sale, is that, well, we're going to do universal background checks, but we've got to have this too. Or the other side says we've got to have that
listen,
too.
As a former U.S. attorney and candidate for Attorney General, you're familiar with all these laws. I don't think people are really up to date as to what the background check process is. What do we have here in Rhode Island and Mass, and what does universal background do to enhance that?
So Rhode Island and Massachusetts have background checks for private sales, as I understand it. So that's locally we've done the right thing. So, but let's go back and talk about what I mean by that. When you go into a federally licensed firearms dealer called an FFL, you have to get a background check. So you've got to fill out an ATF form. It's a standard form. You got to check all these boxes to make sure you're not a prior felon, et cetera, et cetera. Goes down to the FBI. They do a background check. That check comes back before you get the weapon. There's this delayed denial problem, which is a separate conversation, but that's how it works for if you're buying a gun from a federally licensed firearms dealer. If you're buying it at a gun show from a private seller, you don't go through that background check process. So when you don't go through that process, that check isn't done. And
you literally walk into the show and walk out with your weapon.
Correct. Yeah, correct. You know, private sellers have this obligation. If they think there's some reason you shouldn't get it, they're not supposed to give it to you. But the reality is that those checks aren't done. So we ought to close that loophole nationally, because it's not like people don't travel around this country, right? So that's a national problem for which there ought to be, in my judgment, a national response. And almost everybody agrees on that. Nobody gets this distinction by if I buy it from you as an FFL or as I buy it from somebody else who's not an FFL, why I should have to have a check with you and not with somebody else. They should be screening me as to whether I should have that gun. So that's a place where we ought to be able to find some agreement. Most people, I think, agree on that question, but we can't seem to get there because we're arguing over things that on the margins. You know, bump stocks is another one, right? After Las Vegas, bump stocks is going to be an easy fix. That was in October. We still haven't fixed that.
Well, we do have a headline. The president talked about that yesterday. He offered at least some ideas about, everybody getting together. I mean, his enthusiasm level was, 2 out of 10, but he was talking about it. Look, presidential leadership hasn't done us very well. President Obama didn't get very far either after Sandy Hook. I wonder if this is the last one that at least generates some kind of constructive legislative response, or whether this one goes away in another 2 weeks too. What is your thought?
Well, these kids are making it harder to do that, right? These kids are making it harder to do that. I mean, one thing about young people is they know how to use social media, they know how to use, how to reach people, and they're powerful voices. But I think we ought to be talking about, I have about 10 things in my mind that make sense in this space. I'm not convinced we'll ever get all 10 of them, but we ought to be whacking away on the ones we can.
All right, when we come back, we'll see what a few of the 10 are and whether or not they'll be part of Mr. Neronha's campaign for Attorney General. I got my own ideas, too. We'll be right back.
If they're not going to listen to us, it's going to be really embarrassing for them, because 100 kids from a school that was shot up less than a week ago are coming, begging them to have a conversation with us.
So the young people continue to, and by the way, it was interesting in Tallahassee, those kids from Parkland, Florida, a 7-hour trip, by the way, were met by kids in Tallahassee and Orlando, and so there's a generational response to this. I talked to you on the radio the other day. Why can't we just get a restraining order issued for somebody who publicly speaks on social media or any other platform about violent intent?
Yeah, well, I think we can, and other states do. I mean, Connecticut. I think there are 5 states that have that kind of law. Connecticut is one. Oregon, Washington
Specifically,
State.
that says if you type, I want to blow up my school, or I want to take out my teacher, or blah 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 blah, come get your guns.
So the way it works is, take Connecticut for example. The way it works in Connecticut is police officers, caregivers, guardians, parents, whatever, loved one could go to the court. And the court would issue a warrant under the Connecticut statute. They'd have to find probable cause that the person is a danger to themselves or to others, and that there were guns in that person's possession. And based on that, police could seize the weapons, and then there would be a hearing for that person very quickly to determine whether or not that probable cause is well-founded. So, that's a pretty high threshold.
Has it been exercised a lot in those states?
As I read yesterday, I think it's been exercised in Connecticut over 700 times.
Wow. Do we need that here? Yes.
Oh, I think it's a good idea. Yeah, no, I think
you're going to put that forward in your legislative agenda?
It is. It's one of the 10 things that are sort of, I hate to send people to the website, but it sounds like such a candidate. But yeah, it's one of the sort of the 10 things that are in my mind. I mean, I think there's a lot of things we could be doing in this space. That's one of them. I think we should think about that strongly about it. I really think we should think about that. Look, I remember talking to a local police chief when I was U.S. attorney, where a situation came up about an individual, very, very concerned about it, about what this person might do, but hadn't done anything yet. Didn't have a firearm yet. If they had a firearm, maybe or maybe not, maybe they could have had the firearm illegally. What do you do? And this addresses that. But there are lots of things that we could be doing. So for example, and some of them are larger and some of them are smaller. So doctors want to counsel patients about guns in the house, guns in the home, right? Massachusetts has a terrific program where they've given guidance to doctors so they know what they can say. Because some doctors are concerned that they may not be able to counsel patients. We ought to have...
You're talking about internists or psychologists and psychiatrists?
Internists. So sure, you go see a primary care doctor like my wife,
right,
and she counsels you, is there a gun in the home? Doctors want to ask that question for at least some, if not all, of their patients. It's part of good health. So doctors want to know what they can and can't say. They have a program for that in Massachusetts. We should have a program like that
Part of good health because your primary wants to assess your state of mind?
Your state of mind, your family situation. You sit with a patient, I'm not a doctor, but I've been married to one for 20 years. When a patient comes to my wife, primary care doctor, they're talking about a whole host of things. What's going on in the home, what's going on with them, what's going on with a family member, right? They want to be able to counsel patients and be able to counsel them in a way that they're not violating the law.
So we don't have that in Rhode Island?
We don't have that kind of a program. So one of the things that Is
it voluntary or is it mandated?
It's voluntary. It's voluntary. But doctors want the guidance. They want to make sure. There was actually a law in Florida which prevented doctors from doing it, if you can believe that. And it was struck down as a violation of the free speech of the doctors, right? Okay. But doctors want to feel comfortable that they can do it. That's a small thing, but we can do that. We talk about large capacity magazines. I think we should limit the capacity of magazines. People say, well, they can just put another magazine. But every second that you save, right, every extra second, every 1 second, 2 seconds it takes for that shooter to load that clip, you can eliminate that shooter as a threat, or maybe one or two other kids gets away. We ought to talk about that. We talked a little bit about a semi-automatic assault weapons ban. And that assault phrase is loaded, but let's talk about what that is in ways that we can regulate those guns. But let's also remember, too, that every semi-automatic assault weapons ban that exists doesn't take a single gun out of circulation. Every gun is grandfathered that is already out there. So it has to be a multifaceted approach. Our domestic violence restraining orders, there's another one. Our domestic violence restraining orders, when I was U.S. attorney, I was working on a project, and I didn't get it done. But it's something I would revive, which is making sure that every single state restraining order is a restraining order under federal law, because that's what prevents someone from getting a gun when they go to an FFL. So some of these are broad, some of them are legislative, some of them are common sense. Delayed denials, we talked about that on the radio, where the FBI has 72 hours to do the background check. If they don't finish it in 72 hours, not in Rhode Island, it's 7 days in Rhode Island, but in other states, you get the gun. And then the ATF has to go out and chase that gun down. Happened 4,000 times in 2016. We ought to be able to eliminate that by putting more resources on that issue.
What is your point of view on school security? I think that we have, I could not believe after Newtown the nonchalance regarding armed resource officers in the elementary schools. In fact, teachers were fighting it. And I couldn't figure out why an armed resource officer is by law located in high schools and middle schools, but we don't want them in the elementary schools. Our precious cargo, our little ones, right after Newtown.
That doesn't make a lot of sense to me. I think, where to me the divide is.
And I don't think security, by the way, is just an armed guy or a person.
Of course.
The technology and the infrastructure and the bells and whistles that go along with whatever.
Good training the kids on what to do, right? I mean, because the entire.
I'm talking about the equipment and technology.
Well, sure.
But again, we got ceilings leaking all over Kingdom Come.
Sure. So part of it's a resource question, but it's also sort of recognizing that you can secure the front door, but any school that has a window in it, right, is a window that can be shot out. Let's just be candid about what we're talking about here, right? So you got to look at this thing holistically. But when we talk about armed personnel on campus grounds, we're talking about schools now. My view is that it should be trained police officers, and school resource officers are trained police officers, because you want people who are consistently getting training and, frankly, consistently getting checked.
Not the retired vet. I hear that on the phone all the time.
Right.
I don't buy that either.
You want people that are being trained and monitored by the police department generally as part of the job to make sure that they are certified and that they're in a good place too, right? So I think there's a lot of room to do that. But it's going to cost money. To me, that expenditure of resources is worth it to keep our kids safe. I sent a son to high school this year, right? Almost virtually all Rhode Islanders do or have done it in the past, right? All of us care about our kids. To me, if we're going to spend our resources somewhere, let's keep our kids safe.
All right. How much of this is actually going to be prevalent in the AG campaign next? Here's a journal headline, an op-ed piece by a guy by the name of Ted Seidel, who's, I don't know if I'd say he's lurking. He's worth more money than God now. He won $50 million on a SEC effort. This guy has really kind of made a little bit of a name for himself in Rhode Island, arguing about pension funds and what he thinks has been something much larger than a 38 Studios, and that is what he says is the ripoff of the pension system. We'll have him in eventually. Out-of-towner coming in with some big money. Do you know him? Are you concerned about him in a race?
I don't know him. I'm not concerned about anything other than my campaign, right? When I got in it, I wanted to make sure that the experience I brought from being on the line as an AG, being on the line as an assistant U.S. attorney, running the U.S. Attorney's office here, was something I could bring to the AG's office and hopefully make an impact and a difference for Rhode Islanders. That's the only position I was interested in running for, because I felt like that's where I could make a difference. I'm familiar with Mr. Seidel.
His candidacy is very pension-based. He wants to blow up the pension system and take names and prisoners. Do you see anything about our pension history that is investigatable at this point?
Well, look, I certainly have been familiar with the issue over the years, and I know there have been some complaints about how our pensions were invested and some of the transparency around them, and I think those are legitimate questions. I know this, that when I was U.S. Attorney, we focused on conduct that was criminal, and then we went after it, whether that was Gordon Fox or Ray Gallison or the 3 North Providence town councilors or Mayor Moreau. We found the cases and we did the work. I think that's where you have to start. Let's look at what we've got and go after it. You do the work that needs to be done, and you do the work where there's real criminality that you need to go after.
What's going to be the meat of this race now that you're into it? You've made a couple of visits. You raised some money. You're probably you're going to do matching funds, right? Haven't
made the decision yet, but perhaps.
This will not be a multi-million-dollar race if you don't have any competition. You're an odds-on favorite based on your resume and reputation. But who knows? By the June filing deadline, who may get into this whole thing. What's the flavor of this Attorney General's race going to be? Look, is it going to be reflective of the news cycle and God blesses these shootings? Is there a bigger picture in mind here that you've formulated now that you're in it for a while?
So we talked about the school shootings, and that's going to be an issue, right? But it's also got to be brought up in the context of violence as a whole, domestic violence, urban gun violence, right? Which got to be the next priority, got to be the priority of the next AG. I talk about that a lot when I'm speaking to folks in Rhode Island about it. Public integrity, right? you know, regardless of what's going on today or tomorrow, public integrity has to be first and foremost in the eye of the next AG. Look at the cases we did when I was U.S. Attorney. I'm not convinced that we're going to a great age of golden age of good conduct, so you got to keep your eye on that prize. And it's not just about making sure that public officials do the right thing for their oath's sake, but that impacts our economy too.
You know, if you were in a competitive race, and who knows whether you will be, this public integrity thing would be very interesting. Now that I've been here 18 plus years, I'm beginning to think that while everybody says they want it, and no one wakes up in the morning wishing they had it, you, I think, have been most animated in your tenure as U.S. Attorney over public integrity and corruption issues. And for me, you know, my own personal constituency, I'm like, go Neronha, go. I don't know. I don't know.
Yeah.
What's your gut tell you?
Well, look, I know it's important to me, and I think it's resonating. When I'm talking to folks, and I've been out and about all over Rhode Island, I think it resonates. But I know these are the core things of what that office has to do. I know it has to deal with public integrity. I know it has to deal with violent crime. I know it needs to work on a criminal justice system that works, that's smart, and emphasizes things beyond locking people up for as long as possible, that gets people back into the workforce, that diverts young people and get turned around. Those are the things that make that office effective. The civil division, consumers, that's what I'm focused on, because I know that's what counts to Rhode Islanders. I'm convinced I can convince them of what counts if they don't already know that. I think that they do.
Right, your energy for that issue is easy for me to just, I can flip the switch and you go. It begs the question, is the current administration not doing what they should be doing on this level?
You know, we occupied that. You asked me this question before. We occupied a lot of that space when I was U.S. Attorney, right? You know, we did a lot of that work. They were partners with us on a lot of it. My thing is this: that if I'm fortunate enough to be the next Attorney General, I'm not. I should
just remind people what our guest is saying is, as U.S. Attorney on the federal side, you occupy a lot of the prosecutorial.
We did.
Space.
I mean, we did North Providence, we did Mamarone,
right.
We did all the cases we've talked about. But I know this: that if I'm fortunate enough to become Attorney General, I'm going to drive that bus. I'm not going to wait for somebody else to drive it for me. I'm going to drive it.
It's a new sheriff in town type of disposition?
Well, I just think you have to have your eye there. You have to have your eye there. People have to have faith in government, and people who want to do business in Rhode Island have to believe that somebody's paying attention to this issue, or they're not going to want to do business here. And then our kids don't get the kind of jobs we want them to have.
This sexual harassment thing only got 45 seconds, so it's a big topic, or maybe it's not. Does that enter into the campaign and into the purview of the AG?
Well, it does in terms of sexual assault. You know, it doesn't enter
culture conversations, though.
Yeah, well, I think yeah. I mean, look, when I was a DOJ, we were trained on sexual harassment every year from the day I got there 15 years ago, right? Look, if the AG's office or any other state agency isn't doing that kind of training, they should be doing it and should have been doing it for a long time. That's an employment issue. Yeah, we got to train people on that, all across government and across business.
So is the AG's office responsible for the state's behavior in that, or just?
No, I mean, there are a couple of state agencies that deal with hostile work environments, but I think the AG's office can be a leader by setting a good example. So I don't know if they do that kind of training there, but in my administration, if I'm fortunate enough to get there, that would be part of it.
All right, good visit. Thanks.
Thanks,
Peter Neronha, running for AG. Final word when we come back. Private partnerships, you know, how should we get into them? How much of our taxpayer money ought to be used for projects like this, like, of course, a new stadium for the Paw Sox? An editorialist who will share his thoughts on that tomorrow night right here on My State of Mind. In the meantime, we'll see you on the radio at 3 on WPRO. We thank you for watching. Have a great night. Good night.